Right now, you are likely lying perfectly still, while your mind is desperately trying to untangle a knot that belongs to another person. You are carrying the silent, bruising fatigue that comes from watching someone you love struggle, stumble, or create chaos in their own life. It is a unique kind of heaviness in the upper back, a persistent tightness between the shoulder blades that does not dissolve when you close your eyes. You have spent your evening acting as an emotional anchor for a storm you did not cause. Perhaps you have been replaying their modern crises, or anticipating their next collapse, or trying to invent a perfect solution that will finally save them from their own choices. Your mind is completely exhausted from this constant late-night monitoring. You are holding your breath, waiting for the next drop of rain to fall in their life, and your own energy is draining away through the cracks of their unresolved patterns. Let the immediate space around you become a quiet sanctuary from this heavy labor. The room does not demand that you fix anything tonight. Outside your window, the cool night air moves softly through the leaves of the trees, bringing the clean scent of damp earth and late autumn rain. The walls of your room are solid, standing as a peaceful barrier between your spirit and the turbulent moods of the people you have been trying to rescue. Let the mattress absorb the specific weight of your exhaustion, feeling the gravity of the earth pull you down into safety. The darkness here is gentle, thick, and completely neutral. It does not contain the anger, the panic, or the messy choices of those you love. It contains only you and the slow, rhythmic movement of your own breathing. You are not failing as a protector because you are tired. The depletion you feel in your bones is not a sign of a cold heart, but a natural reflection that your internal spirit has become waterlogged by a current that belongs to another. Tonight, your capacity to love is not broken, and we are not going to force your mind to abandon its deep care. We are simply going to change how your heart carries that care. You are allowed to let your hands become completely still on the sheets, and nothing will be demanded of your intellect during these dark hours. Dear friend, right now, maybe you have felt the profound loneliness of being the only strong person in your circle. It is a subtle trap to believe that if you stop worrying for even one night, the lives of those around you will completely shatter. We often mistake this anxious clinging for the true nature of love. We assume that if we suffer alongside someone, or if we absorb their anger, we are somehow helping them heal. But one of the most surprising insights of Buddhist wisdom is that true compassion is never an endless rescue mission that drowns the savior. The heart does not heal a broken river by throwing itself into the mud. Each person is ultimately the owner of their own actions, and you cannot walk the difficult terrain of another's soul, no matter how deeply you love them. Think of your mind during these long hours as a traditional hemp fishing net, cast out into a wide, slow-moving river. When the water is clear, the net moves lightly through the current, wide open and breathing with the river itself. But when someone near you enters a season of heavy emotional storms, their life stirs up a massive cloud of mud, debris, and decaying branches. In your desperate desire to clean the river for them, you have been throwing your net into the thickest part of their silt. You have been dragging the mesh across the rough bottom, trying to catch every floating stick of their chaos, until the ropes are caked with heavy river clay. The net has become so sodden, so packed with the weight of their unresolved choices, that your arms are trembling from the strain of holding the lines. You are threatening to pull your own small boat underwater, trying to lift a weight that the river itself is meant to carry. This constant casting through the mud is what exhausts the modern spirit. We spend our late-night hours dragging the silt of past conversations and future panics into our beds, wondering why our bodies cannot find rest. We tell ourselves that we are being responsible, or that we are being loyal, but we are actually just suffocating our own inner peace under a layer of unearned debris. The suffering you are experiencing tonight is the extra weight of the silt, not the natural flow of the water. You do not have to clean the entire riverbed before you are permitted to sleep. In a moment, we will journey down to a quiet reed valley where the water runs wide and slow. There we will meet an old river monk who understands exactly what it means to hold a heavy line with aching fingers. His simple actions will show us something much softer than a checklist of psychological rules. He will show us how to let the current wash the mesh clean, without needing to abandon the river itself. For now, just let yourself be exactly where you are in the dark. The people you are trying to save will remain exactly as they are for the duration of the night. Their storms will not multiply if you close your eyes, and your worry carries no magical power to alter their destiny while you sleep. Let the rope slip from your grip for a few hours, allowing the net to trail loosely behind the boat without scraping the rough bottom. You are safe enough to let the water flow through the open spaces of the mesh, leaving your hands empty, light, and perfectly at peace in the stillness of the evening. To understand how a heart learns to survive this deep waterlogging of the spirit, it helps to look away from your own life for a moment, letting your awareness travel back to an older, quieter time. Let your mind drift down a long, winding dirt path that drops out of the rocky hills and into a wide, marshy valley where the great river runs slow. The air in this valley is always thick with the scent of wet moss, cold mud, and decaying reeds. The sky stays the color of a wet slate pebble, holding a low autumn fog that covers the opposite bank in a pale, silent mist. In this valley, the only constant sound is soft, rhythmic lap of water against old wood, and the lonely, hollow call of gray water birds as they circle low over the marsh grass. Here in a small reed hut built on wooden stilts right at the junction where two muddy currents collide, lived a young fisherman named Tenzin. He was a man with a strong back and deep, dark eyes, but his face had become lined with the exhaustion that ran deeper than physical labor. Tenzin had inherited his father's wooden skiff, but he spent very little time actually catching fish to sustain himself. Instead, his days were consumed by an entirely different kind of work. Tenzin loved his family, and he loved the people of his small village down the river, but many of them were going through seasons of intense, bitter storms. His younger brother was full of a restless, self-destructive anger. His neighbor was drowning in financial ruin, and his closest friend was paralyzed by a deep, dark sorrow that no words could touch. When Tenzin looked out at the river each morning, he did not see water. He saw a highway of human suffering. Every time a storm hit the hills up above, the river would rise, bringing down massive piles of dark debris, rotting logs, and thick clods of wet clay that choked the shallow channels. Tenzin could not bear to see the water clogged by this turbulence. He felt a deep, crushing responsibility to clean the river for everyone he loved. Each dawn, he would row his small skiff out into the thickest, muddiest part of the current, holding a large net woven from thick braided hemp ropes. It was a heavy, substantial piece of gear meant to be thrown wide across the water. Tenzin would stand at the bow of his skiff, his bare feet gripping the wet planks, and cast his net directly into the dark, swirling eddies where the debris gathered. He would pull the wet ropes back with trembling arms, trying to catch every rotting branch, every patch of choking weeds, and every floating log that threatened to disrupt the village down below. If his brother was angry, Tenzin would spend hours casting his net near the boy's house, trying to pull the anger out of the water. If his friend was weeping, Tenzin would row directly into the gray fog, dragging the river bottom to find the source of the grief, hoping to lift it out of the current so his friend could finally smile. But the river was vast and the mud was infinite. The more Tenzin cast his net into the crisis, the more the river seemed to push back against his efforts. The wet hemp ropes became caked with a thick, heavy gray silt that dried into a stiff crust under the autumn wind. The fine holes of the mesh, which were meant to let the water pass through freely, became completely clogged with wet clay. Decaying leaves and small, jagged stones, the net grew so waterlogged and heavy that it no longer flew wide when he threw it. It simply splashed into the river like a dead weight, sinking instantly to the bottom, where it caught on the hidden rocks. Tenzin's skiff began to sit dangerously low in the gray current. The deck was piled high with wet mud, rotting wood, and sodden ropes that smelled of decay. His hands were covered in deep, raw blisters from pulling the lines, and his lower back throbbed with a dull, hot ache that never left him. Even when he tried to lie down at night, he was completely spent. Yet when he looked down the river, the water was just as muddy as it had been when he started. The people he loved were still struggling, their storms were still raging, and now Tenzin was so weak that he could barely lift his oars to turn the boat around. He felt a dark, bitter resentment growing inside his chest, a quiet anger at the river, at the debris, and at the very people he was destroying his body to save. One evening, as the autumn fog began to freeze on the reeds, Tenzin pulled his heavy skiff up to a lonely gravel bar near the mouth of the valley. Sitting on a flat river stone by the swirling water was an old retired river monk named Master Renjian. The old man wore a simple, faded robe the color of dried mud, and he sat perfectly still, doing absolutely nothing but watching the dark current run past his feet. Next to him on the gravel lay a small, primitive fishing net. Tenzin stepped out of his skiff, his boots sinking into the wet clay, and dropped his massive silt-caked net onto the stones with a heavy, wet thud. "Master Renjin," Tenzin said, his voice cracking with a deep, long-held frustration, "I have given everything I have to this river. I have spent my youth trying to clean the water for my village, trying to pull every dangerous log and every patch of choking mud out of the channels so my family would not drown in the currents. But look at my net. It is so full of silt that I can no longer cast it. Look at my boat. It is sinking under the weight of the debris I have gathered. And despite all my labor, the water remains dark, and the people I love are still caught in the storm. Tell me what secret I am missing. Tell me how to build a stronger net that can hold the entire mud of the river without breaking my back." The old monk did not move for a long time. He listened to the wet slap of the water against the gravel, his eyes following a large rotted birch branch as it floated past the bank, turning slowly in the dark eddy. Then, without a word, Renjin reached down and picked up his own small net. Tenzin leaned closer, expecting to see a complex weave of fine strings or a clever system of iron hooks. But as the old man held the net up against the slate-gray sky, Tenzin gasped in surprise. The net was an incredibly simple, fragile-looking thing, woven from thin river grass, and the spaces between the knots were exceptionally wide. The holes in the mesh were larger than a man's fist. It looked completely useless, a tool that would let every fish and every stick slip through without a struggle. Renjian stood up from his stone, his movements slow and light, carrying no weight. He stepped to the very edge of the gravel bar where the current ran fastest. With a sudden fluid swing of his arm, he cast the wide-meshed net out into the muddy water. The thin grass net expanded beautifully in the air, landing on the surface with a sound no louder than a sigh. It sank softly into the thick, silt-laden current, right in the path of a large cluster of floating weeds and dark mud that was rushing down from the hills. Tenzin watched intently, waiting for the old man to strain against the weight of the river's debris. But the monk did not pull the ropes tight. He did not plant his feet or brace his shoulders. He simply held the line with a loose, relaxed hand, letting the net trail easily in the water. As the dark wall of mud and weeds reached the grass mesh, a strange thing happened. The thick, murky water passed cleanly through the wide, open spaces between the knots. The decaying leaves and the small floating sticks drifted straight through the large holes, continuing their journey down the river without a single pause. The net did not clog. It did not catch the silt. The grass strings remained perfectly clean, vibrating softly in the current like the strings of a musical instrument. When Renjin pulled the line back onto the gravel, the net was completely empty. It held no fish, it held no wood, and it held no mud. It was light, wet, and perfectly clean. The old monk laid it gently on the stones, turned his calm face toward the young fisherman, and pointed to the massive mud-caked pile of hemp that Tenzin had dropped. "Your net is heavy," Renjian said softly, "not because the river is muddy, but because your knots are too small, and your grip is too tight. You have woven a net that is designed to fight the river, rather than live within it." Tenzin looked from the clean grass mesh to his own stiff, encrusted hemp ropes, feeling a cold shock of recognition pass through his stomach. The tight band of resentment around his chest did not vanish, but a small, quiet space began to open up beneath his anger. He looked out at the vast, muddy current, realizing that for years he had been trying to hold the entire river in his boat, and the only thing he had succeeded in catching was his own destruction. But the deeper mystery of the grass net had not yet revealed itself to the young fisherman, and the true transformation of his heavy heart was still hidden down the river, waiting for a night when the fog would turn to ice. This ancient encounter on the gravel bar is not an invitation to turn your back on the people you love. Buddhist wisdom does not ask you to build a wall of cold indifference around your heart, or to look at the pain of a friend or a child and feel absolutely nothing. True peace is not a form of numbness, and it does not require you to become an unfeeling statue while the world around you experiences difficulty. When we look at the old monk sitting by the swirling currents, we see a man who is deeply present to the river. He is not running away from the muddy water, and he is not denying that the debris exists. What he has discovered is a much quieter truth, a way of holding the world that allows love to exist without turning that love into an endless source of self-destruction. The great insight of the Buddha begins with a simple, profound map of how our minds create their own heaviness. In this life, we are all exposed to the natural movements of the river. People we care about will walk through seasons of confusion. They will make choices that cause them pain, and they will bring their emotional storms into our shared spaces. This is the primary turbulence of human existence, the unforced weight of a changing world. But when we mistake desperate clinging for true compassion, we introduce an entirely new kind of suffering into our own bodies. We look at their confusion, and we immediately experience a tight, panicky feeling that says, I must fix this situation right now, or I cannot be okay. This desperate grip is the exact moment we begin to clog our own netting with silt. We take the natural sorrow or anger of another person, and instead of allowing it to flow past like water, we pull our ropes tight to trap it. We believe that if we analyze their problems all night, or if we feel their pain with enough intensity, we can somehow balance the scales for them. This is what it means to live with tiny knots. We create a mesh that is so small, so terrified of letting a single drop of discomfort through, that we end up gathering the mud of 100 different crises into our own beds. The suffering you feel tonight is not the other person's storm. It is the friction of your own net dragging across the rough riverbed of their life. Consider the absolute exhaustion of this Latinite labor. When you lie awake replaying a conversation, trying to manage a mood that belongs to someone else, you are attempting to perform an impossible task. You are trying to lift the entire weight of the river into your small wooden skiff. This desperate craving for control is born out of a beautiful desire to protect, but its structure is entirely fear. We fear that if we stop monitoring the crisis, something terrible will happen. We fear that if we drop the wet ropes, it means we have stopped caring. But this constant vigilance does not clear the channel for the person you love. It only leaves you with raw, blistered palms and a boat that is sitting dangerously low in the dark current. One of the greatest gifts of spiritual transformation is learning how to stop adding a second wound to the initial pain of life. The first pain is the reality that someone you love is hurting. The second wound is the judgment, the resentment, and the exhausting self-blame you layer on top of that reality. You tell yourself that you should be able to save them. You blame yourself for their continued unhappiness, as if their inner landscape were an assignment you failed to complete. This extra layer of struggle is what turns ordinary empathy into a state of chronic inner burnout. The Buddha pointed out that we cannot always stop the first arrow from landing, but we are completely responsible for the second arrow we shoot into our own chests. Awareness, when it is allowed to grow soft and spacious, is the wide grass net that lets the current pass through without clinging to the fibers. It is the quiet capacity of your spirit to notice a wave of someone else's anxiety without instantly turning that anxiety into your personal identity. You can witness their anger, you can feel their grief, and you can still remain a steady vessel that does not capsize. When you allow the spaces between your knots to open up, you discover that you can hold space for a person without needing to absorb the mud they are throwing into the water. The debris can float right through your awareness, continuing its natural journey toward the sea, while your own inner strings remain perfectly clean and light. Impermanence reminds us that no emotional storm lasts forever, and no person remains permanently stuck in their mud. The currents of life are always shifting, and the challenges your loved ones are facing tonight will eventually change their shape. When you realize that their journey is a fluid, evolving path, you can finally release the need to optimization every variable. You can stop treating their immediate distress as a permanent catastrophe that you must resolve before morning. They are walking their own karmic terrain, And sometimes, the most compassionate thing a heart can do is to allow another human being the dignity of their own struggle, without trying to steal the lesson from their hands. True letting go is not an act of abandonment. It is the gentle decision to stop drowning alongside the person you are trying to pull to the shore. It is the realization that your depletion cannot cure their emptiness, and your insomnia cannot buy their peace. By allowing your own net to become empty and clean for the night, you are not closing your heart. You are simply preserving the only sanctuary that can offer them true stability when the storm finally passes. You are choosing to be the steady riverbank rather than the mud that is being swept away by the flood. Slowly, this ancient understanding begins to move closer to the specific quietness of your room. It stops being a lesson about a fisherman on a distant gravel bar, and it becomes the actual texture of the silence you are breathing right now. In a moment, this voice will guide you into the physical reality of this release, moving the insight from the thoughts down into the very muscles that have been carrying the heavy hemp ropes all evening. But before we begin that soft practice, let your spirit rest in the comfort of this one simple truth. You are allowed to let the river flow tonight. You are not required to be the savior of the world while the darkness covers the valley. Let us take the quiet lesson from that damp gravel bar and bring it directly into the space where you are resting tonight. There is no requirement for you to change your position, or sit up, or try to achieve a perfectly disciplined posture of holy stillness. You can remain completely supported by the bed beneath you, allowing your physical frame to settle into the natural gravity of the room. For many hours, your muscles have been acting like the strained hemp ropes of Tenzin's net, holding on tightly to the emotional burdens of the people around you. You can give those tired muscles permission to drop their hold for a little while. If it feels right, invite your breath to become just a fraction slower, letting the air enter and leave your body without any sense of rush, like the gentle tide washing over the smooth river stones. As the breath moves in, you might notice the subtle rising of your chest, a quiet expanding that requires no strategic planning from your intellect. Your body knows exactly how to sustain itself without your constant supervision. On the exhale, let a wave of gentle softening travel down from the crown of your head, easing the small muscles behind your eyes and allowing your jaw to relax. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, releasing the heavy yokes of responsibility you have been carrying all day. There is absolutely nothing you need to fix or solve in this moment. Even simply noticing where the tightness lives in your body is entirely enough. You do not need to push the tension away. You only need to give it a spacious environment where it can finally breathe. Right now, in the open field of your awareness, perhaps a specific thought is floating to the surface. It might be a heavy strand of worry about a family member's future, or a dark memory of a conflict that happened earlier this week. Do not try to fight this thought, and do not blame yourself for having it. Look at it gently, as if it were a loose clump of river weeds drifting into your view. It is just a passing occurrence in the mind. It is not an immediate emergency, and it does not carry the power to destroy your peace unless you pull the line tight. Give this mental pattern a soft, non-judgmental name in your mind, perhaps labeling it silently as rescuing or fixing or protecting. Naming it allows you to step out of the frantic current and become the quiet observer standing securely on the bank. Now, if it feels right, imagine that you are holding the old monk's grass net, the one with the exceptionally wide, open spaces between the knots. The grass strings feel cool and light against your palms, carrying no dried mud or encrusted clay. Take that heavy thought of worry, the one that has been keeping your heart awake, and place it gently into the center of this open mesh. You are not trying to destroy the worry, and you are not trying to force immediate healing onto the person you love. You are simply letting the thought exist inside a different kind of structure. Watch what happens as you hold the net loosely in the current of your awareness, without bracing your shoulders or straining your grip. Let the image transform naturally as you watch, because the spaces between the grass knots are so wide and spacious. The thick mud of that worry does not clog the strings. The dark silt and the heavy fragments of the other person's crisis begin to slide right through the large holes, carried away by the natural flow of the dark river water. The weeds drift down the channel, continuing their own journey toward the vast sea, without leaving a single trace behind on the fibers. The grass net remains perfectly clean, light, and flexible, vibrating softly in the current without catching a single stone. The burden you were terrified of carrying has passed through you, leaving your hands empty and free. Let your attention return comfortably to the physical reality of the air moving past your nostrils. Feel the coolness of the inhale and the complete, unforced warmth of the exhale. You are right here, safe within the dark parameters of your room, and the mesh of your mind has been washed clean of its unearned weight for the night. You do not have to figure out how to guide someone else's life before the sun rises. The crises you are carrying are just temporary turbulence in a vast river system, and you are allowed to let the water handle the debris while you sleep. Let yourself rest within the space beneath the thoughts, the wide, quiet gravel bar that remains steady no matter how much mud flows past the bank. There is no pressure to achieve perfect enlightenment in the next few minutes. True transformation is a slow, organic softening of the heart, like dried hemp ropes gradually becoming pliable when left in the water. If your mind tries to reach back into the current to grab a floating stick of anxiety, do not become discouraged with yourself. The habit of hypervigilance has been your armor for a very long time, and it takes time for the fingers to learn how to remain open. Simply notice that the net has tightened again, and with a soft, forgiving breath, invite yourself to let the lines go slack. Even an inch of space between you and the worry is a massive victory for a spirit that has been waterlogged for so long. And this is where the mind begins to experience a deeper kind of safety. You are realizing that you can care deeply about a person without needing to destroy your own sanctuary to prove your love. The uncertainty of their life is no longer a trap that is pulling you underwater. It is simply the natural landscape of their own growth. In a moment, our journey will take us back to the river valley many years later, where Tenzin must face a massive seasonal flood that threatens to wash away everything he has built. What happened next changed his relationship with the river's turbulence forever, revealing a deeper secret about how to stay afloat when the water rises to the door. For now, just let yourself float in the quiet rhythm of the breath, knowing you are safe enough to soften. 3 winters passed by, and the low fog in the Reed Valley turned to a biting crystal frost that coated the marsh grass in silver needles. Tenzin had learned to row with a lighter hand. Yet the ultimate test of his transformation arrived on a night when the mountain rivers up north completely broke their banks. A massive seasonal flood rushed down into the valley, carrying mud so thick it looked like moving earth, mixed with heavy structural debris, shattered fences, and large uprooted trees from the higher settlements. The village down the river was thrown into an absolute panic. Tenzin's younger brother was consumed by a blinding, frantic terror, rushing along the bank trying to build a wall of loose mud that washed away instantly. His closest friend sat in the freezing rain, paralyzed by a familiar despair as the dark water crept toward the threshold of the home. Tenzin felt the old, violent pull of his former habits, waking up inside his chest like a sudden flame. His heart began to beat with a rapid, suffocating rhythm, and his shoulders instantly hardened as his mind shouted that he must launch his boat, throw his heavy hemp ropes across the flood, and single-handedly anchor the lives of everyone around him. He ran down to the water's edge, his boots slipping in the freezing clay, his hands reaching for the coarse dock lines. He was on the very verge of jumping back into the old rescue mission that had nearly drowned him years before. He believed that if he did not absorb their terror and fight the current with his own body, the entire world would end in ruin. But as the freezing spray hit his face, Tenzin paused. He did not jump into the boat. He stood completely still on the slippery bank for 3 full breaths, letting the cold air fill his lungs and let the panic roar around him without instantly obeying its command. He looked at his hands, which were already shaking with a familiar exhaustion, and he remembered the wide grass net on the gravel bar. He recognized that if he threw himself into the center of this specific mud tonight, he would not save his brother or his friend. He would simply add one more drowning man to the river. Instead of launching the skiff into the dangerous currents, Tenzin turned away from the water and walked back up the ridge to the small stone hut where Mother Ashen lived. She was an elderly artisan who spent her days weaving the long nets from dried river grass, and she was known across the valley for having hands that were deeply calloused but remarkably light in their movements. When Tenzin pushed open her heavy reed door, the air inside was completely warm and calm, smelling of dried sweetgrass, warm rice wine, and old cedar shavings. Mother Ashen was sitting quietly on a low wooden bench by a small charcoal brazier, completely undisturbed by the roar of the flood outside. "Mother Ashen," Tenzin said, his voice tight with the strain of his resistance. "The river is destroying everything down below. My brother is losing his mind to fear. My friend is drowning in hopelessness. And I am trembling because I cannot fix the water for them. I want to launch my boat, but I know my net will only gather the silt until it drags me under. Please, show me how a heart stays alive when the entire valley is being swept away by the mud." The old woman looked up from her work, her eyes soft and bright in the amber glow of the coals. She did not offer him a speech about patience, and she did not tell him that his family would be magically protected from the storm. Instead, she reached down to the wooden floor beside her bench and lifted a small, simple object. It was a smooth bamboo float, a hollow cylinder of pale wood, completely empty inside, sealed at both ends with dark resin, and bound with a simple loop of braided grass rope. She placed it into Tenzin's rough palms. "This float carries no weights," Mother Ashen said, her voice slow and rhythmic like the swaying of dry reeds. "It holds no iron hooks, and it has no capacity to catch a single fish or trap a single floating branch. Its only nature is to remain on top of the water." Tenzin turned the hollow piece of wood over in his hands, feeling its incredible lightness. "But how can an empty float save my village?" he asked, looking back toward the dark door. "The current is full of rocks and heavy trees. If I attach this to a net, it will not stop the debris from coming down the mountain." The old woman stood up, her joints popping slightly in the quiet room. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark, rushing torrent down below. "The float is not meant to stop the river from being a river," she replied softly. "The mistake you continue to make, young fisherman, is the same mistake you made when the water was low. You believe that holding space for the people you love means you must let their storm tear down your own sanctuary. You think that if you do not feel their terror, you are being cruel. But look at the flood." Tenzin stood beside her, looking down at the dark valley. In the dim moonlight, he could see a massive log rushing down the channel. It struck a large, rigid willow tree that stood firmly in the path of the current. The wood groaned, the roots tore, and the entire tree was ripped from the soil, disappearing into the muddy foam. But right beside the fallen tree, a small patch of green river grass was completely submerged by the wave. As soon as the crest passed, the grass popped back up to the surface, perfectly intact, its blades shiny and clean. "When the river rises," Mother Ashen said, touching the hollow bamboo in his hands, "the grass net must have a float at the top, just as it has a weight at the bottom. If you only carry the weights, the net will always be dragged into the mud. The float is your willingness to let the current pass completely beneath you. It is the clarity that allows you to see their suffering without turning that suffering into your own identity. You must learn to be the empty wood, Tenzin. You must let the flood be high while you remain light on the surface." Tenzin looked down at the smooth bamboo float, and for the first time in his life, a profound realization settled into his bones. He realized that his brother's anger and his friend's despair were not assignments he had been given to complete. They were independent currents, walking through their own difficult seasons, and his attempt to control the water was actually preventing them from finding their own buoyancy. He had been acting like the rigid willow tree, hardening himself against the storm until his own roots were ready to snap. What followed was a very small shift in the young fisherman's behavior. But it was the true beginning of his transformation. He did not return to the riverbank to shout instructions at his brother. He did not go back to the skiff to drag the silt. Instead, he chose a quiet act of discipline. He sat down on the wooden floor of the hut, placed the smooth bamboo float in his lap, and closed his eyes. He listened to the terrifying roar of the flood outside the walls, but he stopped treating the sound as a command to react. He simply allowed the storm to exist. sitting in the warm cabin, holding the light wood, breathing in and breathing out through the long hours of the darkness. He did not become a perfect master of his mind in that single evening. A dozen times, his thoughts tried to convince him that he was being selfish, or that his silence was a form of betrayal. But each time the old habit returned, he gently placed his hand on the hollow float, remembered its empty nature, and returned to the immediate presence of his own breath. He allowed the valley to be loud, and he allowed his own heart to be still. When the morning sun finally broke through the slate-gray clouds, the floodwaters had begun to recede, leaving thick mud on the banks. But Tenzin's boat was still securely tied to the post, and his own spirit was completely unbroken. In a moment, this story will show us something even closer to your own Latinite struggles. It will show us exactly how this empty bamboo float applies to the modern relationships that are currently keeping your mind awake. But before we bridge that distance, let your spirit remain for a few moments within the quiet warmth of Mother Ocean's cabin, letting the weight of the world float safely outside your borders. This quiet sitting in the warmth of the cabin reveals a deeper layer of the psychological landscape we navigate every night. When we look closely at our chronic depletion, we discover that the mind is often caught in a hidden, repetitive loop of trying to heal the self through a subtle form of violence. We believe that if we criticize our hesitation enough, or if we replay our past mistakes with enough intensity, we can force ourselves to become invulnerable. This constant self-judgment operates like an invisible anchor dragging behind our spirit, digging into the mud of old conversations and pulling us backward into the dark. We have turned our natural empathy into a rigid personal identity, defining ourselves not as a person resting in a peaceful room, but as a permanent emotional rescue vehicle that is never allowed to turn off its lights. One of the most profound insights of Buddhist wisdom is the clear distinction between the actual weight of the water and the extra burden we add by trying to hold it all. Think of the natural occurrences of life as a seasonal tide. Someone you love is walking through a dark forest, or a relationship is experiencing a painful shift, or a sudden change has disrupted your sense of external security. This initial movement is simply the raw texture of a changing world. It carries a real chill, a real heaviness, and a genuine sorrow. But the suffering we carry tonight does not live inside that initial current. The real suffering is the secondary storm we build out of our own resistance. We look at the rising water, and we immediately drop heavy boulders of panic into our own laps, weeping because we cannot force the river to run in the opposite direction. To understand this mechanism, imagine your inner awareness as a clear, shallow riverbed made of smooth sand. The emotional crises of the people around you are like the dark silt washed down from the hills during a rainstorm. If you leave the riverbed alone, the water will carry the silt naturally through the valley, eventually depositing it into the deep ocean. The sand may be covered for an hour or a day, but the current itself remains unblocked. The extra suffering happens when we try to build a rigid wooden dam across the flow using our own thoughts. We block the current with our anxiety, trying to trap the mud so we can analyze it, filter it, and fix it before it passes down the line. By blocking the water, the silt accumulates behind our thoughts, turning our clear inner sanctuary into a stagnant, heavy marshland that begins to swallow our own peace. Peace does not arrive because you have finally found a way to guarantee that the people you love will never suffer. True ease of heart is not a state where the river never brings down mud or the sky never darkens with storm clouds. It is a completely transformed relationship with the movement of the water itself. When you attach the smooth bamboo float of awareness to the top of your spirit, you are changing how you meet the turbulence. You are choosing to let the high waves pass completely beneath you without needing to absorb their debris into your muscles. You can look out at the rough current with a soft, non-judgmental gaze, recognizing that every human being must walk through their own winter before they can find the spring. Their struggle is not your failure, and your exhaustion cannot purchase their freedom. We often cling to our hypervigilance because we are terrified of what will remain if we let the ropes drop. Overthinking can feel like an act of loyalty, a strange kind of devotion that convinces us we are keeping the world safe by staying awake in the dark. We fear that if we stop rehearsing the worst-case scenarios, we are somehow abandoning the people who lean on us. But this constant late-night monitoring is an illusion of control that creates the very weight it seeks to cure. You do not need to preserve your anxiety to remain a loving presence. By allowing the sand of your inner riverbed to remain clear and unblocked, you are preserving the only true place of refuge that can offer them real stability when their own storm finally runs out of rain. Let this understanding settle into the deep, physical parameters of your body right now. Notice the subtle change in your pulse when you give yourself explicit permission to stop acting as the emotional keeper of the valley. The crises that felt so suffocating an hour ago are still moving through the world, but they are no longer stretched across your chest like heavy, wet hemp lines. They are simply part of the infinite river, flowing toward their own natural conclusions. You can look at the loose ends of your relationships with a quiet, forgiving heart, understanding that human spirits are permitted to be unfinished, messy, and confused without needing to be fixed before the morning. Slowly, this quiet integration begins to change the way your mind prepares for tomorrow. The wisdom of the empty float is not designed to remain an ancient parable about a fisherman in a frozen valley. It is built to step directly into the small, complicated dynamics of your modern daylight, altering the way your spirit responds when the next wave of pressure hits your shore. In a moment, we will look directly at how this open awareness operates in your daily encounters, showing you how to practice the art of the wide knot amid the rush of a chaotic world. But before we explore that immediate terrain, let your spirit rest in the absolute safety of this one realization. You are allowed to be just one vessel, floating light and empty on top of the deep night. Slowly, this ancient perspective begins to walk down from the cold mountain ridge, leaving the smell of sweetgrass behind to enter the landscape of your modern daylight. The wisdom of the wide grass net is not a relic meant to stay hidden in an old storybook. It is a practical, gentle framework designed to protect your heart during the most ordinary hours of your week. Consider how this internal weight manifests in the small, familiar routines of your life. You find yourself sitting at a desk or standing in a kitchen, staring down at a small glowing screen in the palm of your hand. You are waiting for a text, or an email, or a specific sign of approval from someone whose mood suddenly shifted into cold distance. In those quiet seconds of waiting, the old habit of your mind wakes up instantly, before you even realize what you are doing. You cast your heavy hemp net right into the deepest mud of their silence. You begin to drag the river bottom, replaying old conversations and looking for the exact moment you might have made a mistake. Your mind creates a massive web of assumptions, imagining the worst possible outcomes, until your neck hardens with physical stress. You check your phone for reassurance 20 times in a single hour, hoping a single message will somehow lift the heavy weight from your chest. You are trying to manage their distant internal storm from your bedroom, and your own day is being entirely swallowed by their current. Have you noticed how easily we turn a simple daily delay into a structural crisis? When someone around you is having a difficult day, your mind immediately treats their discomfort as your personal assignment. You walk into a room where the air is thick with a partner's irritation or a family member's anxiety, and you instantly become the human filter. You smile brightly, you speak softly, and you try to smooth over every rough edge, pretending everything is perfectly fine while your inner spirit is carrying an absolute mountain of wet clay. You are exhausting yourself by trying to clean a current that belongs to the earth. This late-night overthinking is nothing more than your net dragging across a riverbed it was never meant to touch. When you lie awake at midnight, replaying a minor social awkwardness or fearing a future change, you are trying to lift a heavy log into a boat that is already sitting dangerously low in the water. We look at the beautifully arranged lives of the people around us, comparing their polished surfaces against the messy underside of our own daily struggles. Your mind whispers that you are falling behind, that your boat is leaking, and that you are not doing enough to secure your place in the world. You want to rest, but a deep sense of unearned guilt keeps your fingers tightly gripped around the wet ropes. But let the memory of the empty bamboo float return to your awareness during those difficult daylight hours. True practice does not require you to change your entire life path in a single morning, nor does it ask you to force a state of perfect, unbothered enlightenment. Peace is practiced in the very small spaces between your immediate reactions. It is the simple, quiet choice to pause for 2 full breaths before you respond to an angry message or step into a chaotic conversation. In that tiny boundary of time, you are attaching a float to the top of your net. You are allowing the other person's turbulent energy to pass cleanly through your awareness without needing to trap it inside your own muscles. You can care for your family, your work, and your responsibilities with an immense depth of devotion, without turning that care into a heavy noose around your neck. To love a person completely does not mean you must allow their storm to wash away your own foundation. When you notice a fearful thought rising in your chest, telling you that everything will fail if you stop worrying, you can look at that thought without granting it your obedience. You can say to yourself softly, "This is just the old mud rolling down the channel." You do not have to throw your net into it. You can let the thought exist as a temporary guest in the room, while you remain the steady, unmoving bank. Rest is not a luxury you must purchase by solving every problem in your life first. The grass net does not need to catch every piece of debris to deserve a quiet night drying on the deck. In the light of Buddhist wisdom, your right to experience a peaceful sleep is entirely absolute, completely independent of whether your relationships are perfectly settled or your future is guaranteed. You are permitted to leave the river exactly as it is when the sun goes down. By giving yourself permission to hold an unfinished day, you dissolve the very panic that keeps your heart racing in the dark. The currents of tomorrow will arrive in their own time, and they will be met by a heart that is learning how to float. Slowly, this quiet integration begins to prepare your spirit for the deepest rest of the evening. The dilemmas that felt like emergencies during the day are losing their sharp edges, becoming nothing more than distant movements in a wide river system. You are becoming a person who knows how to hold space for the world without letting the world drown you. In a moment, our journey will reach its final destination, where the stories fade away completely, and the language slows down into the absolute silence of the night. Before we enter that final quietness, let yourself absorb the comfort of this one simple realization. You have carried the lines long enough for this day. The boat is moored, the nets are empty, and you are allowed to let go. Continue. The boat is moored, the nets are empty, and you are allowed to let go. Let the thick, dark velvet of the night fully enter the space around your bed now. The small wooden skiff of your awareness has finally found its quiet resting place against the bank. The heavy dock ropes are wrapped securely around the old willow stump, holding the hull steady against the gentle rise and fall of the autumn current. You can hear the slow, rhythmic slop of the water as it laps against the dark planks, a sound that does not require your attention or your effort. The entire valley has settled into a profound, freezing silence. The air is perfectly still, holding the cool scent of damp earth and late autumn frost. The clouds that hovered over the marsh grass all afternoon have parted, leaving only the endless dark sky and the cold starlight reflecting cleanly on the slow surface of the river. Your physical frame is becoming remarkably heavy now, sinking deep into the mattress as if you were settling into the soft sand of a protected shore. Feel the long, chronic tightness in your lower back begin to loosen its grip, like wet hemp fibers finally losing their stiff crust when left to dry in the cool air. The shoulders can spread out completely, dropping the invisible yokes of responsibility you have carried through the daylight hours. Your fingers can uncurl, lying loose and soft against the sheet, no longer poised to pull a heavy line or catch a falling branch. For many hours, your mind has been standing at the bow, bracing its muscles against a storm it could never control. Tonight, the great casting is over. The nets are laid out perfectly flat, clean and completely empty across the dark deck, drying beneath the silent winter stars. Let the memory of the smooth bamboo float sink deep into your heart as you breathe out. You do not need to build a flawless mud wall around the people you love before you are allowed to close your eyes. The confusion they are navigating, the mistakes they are making, and the storms they are experiencing are not failures of your loyalty. They are the natural movements of a vast river system, that has been flowing long before you arrived. You are permitted to leave their currents alone in the dark. You are permitted to let the water be high and let the silt be thick without needing to drag your spirit through the clay to prove your devotion. You are allowed to be an empty, floating presence tonight, completely detached from the weight of the bottom. Listen to the quiet, unforced movement of your own breath. Each inhale brings the clean, cool spaciousness of the valley night into your chest. Each exhale is a slow releasing of the unearned burdens you gathered from the world. The anxieties that kept your pulse racing all evening are nothing but loose, weightless debris drifting far down the channel, continuing their journey toward the great sea. They carry no power to disturb your sanctuary, unless you reach out your arms to trap them. Let the debris float past. Let the river carry what belongs to the river, while you remain safely moored to the steady bank, untouched by the turbulence of the deep water. The light within your mind is fading into a deep, comforting dark, like the small charcoal brazier in Mother Ocean's cabin slowly turning to quiet ash. The dilemmas that felt like immediate crises during the day are losing their shape, dissolving into the vast, neutral silence of the evening. You are returning to your own inner temple tonight, stepping into the wide, unblocked space of your true nature. Here, there are no expectations to fulfill, no roles to perform, and no savior identities to defend. You are simply the space that notices the night, a clear and steady presence that remains whole even when the world around you is confused. The future will bring its own raw fiber when the sun rises, but the dark hours belong entirely to your own restoration. Let yourself sink completely into the heavy currents of your sleep. The valley is still, the boat is secure, and the mesh of your spirit is perfectly light. You do not have to solve the lives of the people you love before the morning comes. You are safe enough to drop the ropes. You are safe enough to let the awareness soften, and safe enough to slide down into the deep, sweet shadows where even the river runs silent in the dark. And if the greatest gift you could ever offer to the storms around you was the quiet, unbending solidity of your own unburdened rest,